Good morning and welcome to Across the Arts. I'm your host, Patrick D. McCoy, and thank you so much for joining me today for this special installment of the Maestro series. The guest that I have on today is no stranger to choral music in the African American community as far as his contributions to the arts and the compositional world of choral music. I talk none other than about Dr. Marvin V. Curtis. Personally speaking, Marvin V. Curtis is certainly a part of the soundtrack of my music upbringing, and I just remember the opportunities that I had to learn of his great work, reading about him as a child in the Jet magazine when he wrote the anthem, A City on a Hill, for President Clinton's inauguration. And we're going to talk more about that. But I do want to take this opportunity to thank him so much for joining us. And without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Marvin Curtis. Good morning, Dr. Curtis. Good morning, Dr. Curtis. Thank you so much for joining the Maestro series.
Good morning, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
Oh my goodness, it is such a treat. As I was sharing with the listeners, I remember that when I was more of a teenager, and my mom used to always get all the Jet magazines, and for some reason this story zeroed, in on you for some reason, and I was reading further, and it was when you wrote A City on a Hill, and so I always wondered, like, who is this great man Marvin Curtis? So we're going to talk about that further, but again, thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So Dr. Curtis, for those who may not be aware of your career and your background, I do know that you're a native of Chicago. Talk to the audience about Chicago and the impact on your development, in particular your family, how your family nurtured your upbringing.
Well, my mother, at the age of 3, for me, decided to buy a piano for my brothers and I. I was 3, my other brother was 2. My youngest brother was not born yet. So she bought an instrument, and the lady down the street gave us piano lessons. No idea we had any talent. And when you're 3 years old, you do what you're told. Yeah, exactly. And we lived on the south side of Chicago. Eventually, we moved farther south, but the piano became a part of our life. And so I went from that teacher to a lady named Mrs. Scott, who taught me for several years, and my brothers. And in 1960, we gave a recital at Fulton Hall at the Art Institute. It was called the Curtis Brothers. My brother Daryl, my brother Wesley. It's the first time I ever wore white tie and tails. It was 1960, I believe, or 61, and they were wool.
Ooh.
June. So you can imagine what it was like for a little boy to be dressed up. However, that led us to the next thing, which was organ lessons. I studied with John Martin in Chicago. I was 11 when I started, and I was tall enough to reach the pedals. So that's how I got so my mother bought a Hammond organ with 32 pedals on it. And so we took organ lessons. And I got my first church job as an organist at age 13. And I made $10 a month and thought I was rich. It was 1962. But I had some great teachers. At that time, we also joined the National Association of Negro Musicians. And Josephine C. Ennis was the youth director, but she was also our piano teacher. So for the next 4 years, I studied with her, got involved with NAM at a very early age. But also in high school, I studied with Lena McGlynn, who was the choir director at Harlan High School. And so she was there for 2 years. I was a student of hers. And then studied with a man named A. Bankston Owens. People may remember him from Chicago. And Mr. Owens introduced me to a man named Irving Bunton, who was the director of the All City High School Choir. And that turned me on to choral music. And from there was a lot of support, of course, from mom and dad. My father said to us when we were 8 years old, when I was 8 years old, that you would take piano lessons till you're out of high school. At that point, I thought, that's forever. You're 8 years old. But it became my career. And of course, there was always in the back of my mind, this was something I wanted to do. I ended up going to North Park College then as a music major and got my start.
Wow. Let's go back and talk a little bit more about Lena McLean. And the reason that I would like to do so, because anytime I talk to somebody from Chicago, Lena McLean seems to be the thread. Even just as early as last night, Nicole Houston Lane, soprano, was being interviewed on last night. And she mentioned that Lena McLean was her music teacher. Could you maybe talk about that lineage of
Yeah,
great artists who studied with her?
there were so many of us that went through Linda McLean. But when I was in high school at Harlan High School in Chicago, she was the choir director, and she had these huge choirs. She had a women's chorus, a men's chorus, the mixed chorus, and I think at one point it was more important to be in the choir than to be on the football team. You know, because we did all the performances, we did all the competitions. She introduced me to operetta.
Oh.
So when I was a sophomore, we did HMS Pinafore,
Oh
and,
my goodness.
and played the piano and taught all the parts. And the art director, art teacher at the school worked on the art design and the sets. We did a full production, and I still do HMS Pinafore to this day. She did Trial by Jury. She did an operetta, Gilbert and Sullivan, every year. So that was part of her legacy. I was fortunate that I was in the choir when her first piece, Glory, Glory, Hallelujah, was published. So I sang it in manuscript, and then I sang it as a published piece. We also did her mass when I was in high school. And so she was a great influence. And she recognized, I think, the talent I had and sort of pushed me. But in terms of my piano work, she was a great, as you know, Lena is about 5 feet tall. And she wore 5-inch heels back then and a long leather coat. And she went to the room and you just snapped her attention. You know, she was not to be played with. But I think the legacy that she had was that she taught a lot of us about Black music. I discovered Nathaniel Dett through Lena McLean. The girls' chorus at Harlan High School did a piece, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross by Nathaniel Dett. Fabulous piece of music. And that's the first time I ever heard of Nathaniel Dett. And at that time, when he wrote the piece, he was choir director at Bennett College. He had left Hampton, gone to Bennett. And there were these low E's for the altos. But she turned that piece out, and it was one of my favorite pieces to this day. But she taught us so many wonderful pieces of music, introducing us to Black composers. But we didn't know, we just knew it was part of what we did. We didn't know that they were necessarily Black composers. They were composers, along with everything else that we did. So she was quite an influence, as you know, in Chicago, and taught so many people. And was just a great person to have. And I saw her several years ago. She remembered me and called me over to her, and we talked a little bit. And I thanked her for what she did, because she really was an influence in our lives.
Thank you so much. I want to go a little bit further back because I would be remiss if I didn't mention, COVID-19 and how artists have all had to regroup during this time. But you've been diversifying for a long time because you're a church organist, you're a composer, you're a conductor, college professor. You've had all of these different myriads of the music career. So could you maybe talk about in this moment, how has COVID-19 affected you and your daily life right now in this moment?
Well, as you're aware, I just retired from Indiana University South Bend, um, July 1, but we have not been in class since March. And so from March until the end of the school, till July 1, it's been very difficult because all performances were canceled, all trips were canceled. I did not see my students, except they did a little drive-by on me, a little farewell thing. It was really sort of cute on the front of lawn of my house. Um, but it's been very difficult because you can't plan.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways, I'm sort of glad I am going to be retired. I am retired because I don't have to deal with what may be coming down the pike. I do know that's going to be very difficult doing performances with choirs and orchestras, but I'm still serving on the boards of the South Bend Symphony, and I'm on the board of the public television station here. And so I'm serving. I just got asked to be on the board of the Fishoff Chamber Music Society. So I'm still serving in that capacity, but they're all Zoom meetings, obviously. But we're talking about what's going to happen when this is all over. So COVID-19 put a real stopper in a lot of things that we had planned for the end of the year. And I felt for my students because they didn't get to complete, as I felt a lot of students that didn't have their high school graduations and proms. And it's difficult. This is a very hard time for artists because there are no venues per se. You can't go to an opera, you can't go to a musical. If you do one, it has to be socially distanced. And how do you do that? How do you do all these different things? So I think when we come out of this, we'll have some different ideas about how art can still happen. And I'm glad to see that art is still happening online, but it's not the same as being in that auditorium. So, but as an artist, I learned early on that you have to diversify your career. I wanted to be a concert pianist. When I was in high school, I saw Van Cliburn, I saw Andre Watts, and I was going to be like that. I went to college and decided I'm not going to practice that much because it was like there's so much else going on in the world, and there were other things to do. And so choral music sort of gravitated towards me, and that gave me a chance to make sounds as well as the piano and use the voice. I was in choirs, obviously, in high school and in college. Learned some great literature. I also learned how to administrate even at the college level. I was in charge of several committees on the college campus and in charge of homecoming. So you learn how to make things happen. And so in my career, it's about making things happen. And as I got older and started teaching, I realized that my students needed more than I could give them and what the school could give them. So therefore, I had to learn how to write grants and find money to augment their education. And so that led me to writing grants, particularly when I was in college teaching, to make programs happen because there wasn't enough money ever for all those different things. And students needed those experiences. And so that got me noticed. At Fayetteville State, I wrote almost $250,000 worth of grants. My first one was for production of the Marvin V visitors that we did. And after that, I kept writing them and becoming involved with arts councils and learning how to maneuver, learning how to work with people across the spectrum. I learned how to also take music and work with artists that were fine artists, that were dancers, that were in theater. So I was not just confined to just the piano, but the piano was my foundation. And so at one point, and as you know, I was a church musician, have been a church musician. I started at Hartselle Methodist Church in Chicago. And when I got into college, I was in the Marvin Night Visitors as the page my first year. It's my first time being on stage. But later on, I worked at the Riverside Church in New York City.
Oh, wow.
It was there that I got to meet David Mannion, who was in charge of the theater of Riverside Church. Wow. And I became the director of Amal and Godspell and learned how to play the scores of musicals. I also worked at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Brooklyn, one of my favorite places to be. And that is where I was able to take the choral skills I had learned and use those to create choirs and performances. We ended up going to Lincoln Center, Al Study Hall in 1983, did a major concert and included a play in the middle of the concert, wrote music, an orchestra. There was a black church choir on the stage of Al Study Hall for almost 2 hours performing music. And it was great. And that got me started in that whole field again. So church work was very good for me as well.
Wow. So you had you've had these great experiences, particularly as a conductor. But now I want to zero in a little bit on your gifts as a composer, especially during this time when the gifts, particularly of African American artists, are being illuminated. Could you talk about your compositional style? Because I think sometimes when people run across composers of color, they automatically assume that this person is writing gospel or writing spirituals, and that's not a negative. But I just want you to speak a little bit about the diversity of styles that you've been able to compose in.
Well, coming out of the black church, particularly Hartselle Methodist Church, we sang anthems, we sang spirituals, we did a little bit of gospel, and we also did major works. And as you know, in Chicago, you can go any Sunday to any big church and hear an oratorio in Chicago back in the 60s when I was growing up. So what I did was I think I took the style of what I learned in church the anthem style, particularly, because that's what I was playing more than anything else, and began to craft compositions in that style. But I also had a deep love for the spiritual. And because of my teachers like Linda McLean and Irving Button and others, I understood part of what it was, but not all of it, because I did not know all the background. But I did know the rhythms, and the conductor I had in college was named David Thorburn at North Park College. And we did 2 pieces every year by Bashaw and Alice Parker. So that gave me another foundation. And it was in my junior year of college that I went home for Christmas and wrote a piece called Gloria and brought it back to Dr. Thorburn. And he said, write me another one. So I wrote By and By. And my junior year in college, we went on choir tour. And the choir performed my music every night. And we were in California, Oregon, Washington State, Minnesota, and finally at Orchestra Hall. And here was my 2 works on the program, an unpublished 20-year-old composer writing in this spiritual style that I had learned in church. It was later on that I began to branch out a little bit more and decided to try my hand at writing something a little bit more, less of a spiritual, but more of an anthem kind of style. But it still had that flavor to it. That's where Worship the Lord came in. And I wrote that, and through Irving Button met Jim McKelvey, who was the owner of Mark Foster Music. I sent him my compositions, and this is after, of course, being rejected by several publishers. I got a letter back and said, we want to publish your music. I was ecstatic. I was 24 years old, and it was the bicentennial of America.
Wow.
When a package arrived at my door with my composition in it, with my name on it. And I just about jumped out of my skin. It was just to see my name in print. And it was followed by Gloria, followed by and By. And it kept following everything I wrote. He published. And it was praising song. I think they really landed me on the map. I did a commission for a school in Michigan. And I wrote the piece in Jim's office, literally. And it became one of my best sellers, still to this day.
Wow. And I'm actually going to play that for everyone. Dr. Curtis's piece that he's speaking of, Worship the Lord. If you all give me a little patience here. And while we have this little moment here, please put your questions for Dr. Curtis in the chat box, particularly if you're a young composer and want to ask some things about style. We would greatly welcome those questions towards the end. So let's see. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's
It
an
was a long
amazing piece. Uh-oh, wait a minute. I think I'm hearing something else about to start. Oh. Is somebody trying to give us the benediction? There we go.
That was me.
So, Dr. Curtis, how does it feel when, I mean, you may have touched on this a little bit, but I guess I want to go back to it. Like, how does it truly feel in the beginning when your writing wasn't readily received, and now you get this package on your doorstep, and now you hear your music heard all around the world, and especially on social media? How does that make you feel?
Very proud, obviously. Very touched that people like what I do. But the music is more about the message. And so it's a message thing that I've tried to convey my own personal faith that I grew up with into the music that I write. It took me a long time I only wrote sacred music, as I called it, for many, many years until I was asked then to write orchestral works, which meant that there were no words. And so I did that. I've done that now, and that's a little different. But when you hear your own compositions and you hear people interpret them, and you hear and you meet people that have sung them, it does something to your heart, that something that you created, that God has allowed you to create, has touched people. And so just hearing that brought back memories of back in the
Wow.
70s, kid, when I was a kid, when I was young, and how far I've come since that time period.
I want to go now to, I would say, perhaps one of your big milestone pieces, which is your inaugural anthem called "A City on a Hill." Could you maybe talk about how did that come about and that feeling of writing for such? And I want to make sure you're the first African American composer to write for inauguration,
Yeah,
correct?
correct.
Okay. Could you speak about that and how that came about?
Well, it was a very funny story. I was at Virginia Union University teaching the choir, and it was the Martin Luther King concert of 1992, and we was to sing at Hampton University with another choir led by Stephen Hayes from Philander Smith College. I had never met Stephen. I had heard about Philander Smith because we were up in the Methodist Church. There was a big name that we heard about. And so his choir sang, my choir sang. His choir was fabulous. And I went over and I talked to him. I'm a very friendly person, so I went over, introduced myself. Stephen, of course, had heard about me already. And we stuck up a friendship. And it continued after we left. That was in January. That following June, Bill Clinton was nominated for president, as you remember, and was in New York. And at the climax of his speech, the Philander Smith College Choir, collegiate choir, climbed the podium and sang. And so somehow I managed to find Stephen in New York and called him and congratulated him. September rolled around and I got a phone call at my office. And Stephen said to me, they had been told they were asked to sing at the inauguration, at the inaugural ceremonies, not necessarily the inauguration. And would I write a piece for them to sing? I thought he was teasing me, He said, okay, fine, whatever. And hung up the phone. And I called him back and I said, what did you ask me? And he said, told me again. And I said, are you sure? He said, yes. I said, why me? Because I know you can get it done. And he said he wanted a piece with broad African American themes, but not a gospel piece. He wanted an anthem.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't write gospel anyway, so what the problem? So I, right away, into my head popped the word city on a hill. And I thought it was in scripture. And I went right into my Bible, could not find it. And through a friend of mine in California who was my librarian, I was doing my doctorate. This was the beginning of the internet. She was able to find for me the quote. And the quote was not in the Bible, it was from Governor Winthrop of Massachusetts back in 1683, something like that. And so it was the whole text. And it said in the description, a favorite text of Ronald Reagan. And I thought, I can't do that just yet. And then it went down and said, it was also a favorite text of John Kennedy. I thought, I'm good with that. So I took that text and began to think about where this piece was going to be done. And I kept thinking it was going to be done in some great cathedral. All I could think of was, St. Paul's, Westminster Abbey. Da, da, da. So I began to craft this text around the city on the hill, and it's in 5 parts. And I thought about Stevenson African American themes, and of course Isaiah 40 ran across my mind. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. That's African American as nobody can get at.
Mm-hmm.
And went to Colossians, went to Philippians, and put together this text, and sat down, and then it took me about a month to gather the text together. It took me a weekend to write the piece. So I called my publisher. I called Jim in Chicago, and I told him what was going on. I said, but you can't tell anybody because there was no election yet. So he said, well, fax me what you got. So as I'm writing, I'm faxing him pieces of the composition as I'm writing it. And he sent it back corrections. And finally, about the end of October, I had it finished. And I sent it to Stephen. And he said he wanted it for trumpets and trombones. So that was easy. So I did that, and then waited for the election. And sure enough, the man won the election. And now I'm like, what happens next? Because I got this piece, but I still can't tell anybody that I've written this piece for the ceremony. Because I didn't know what the ceremony was going to be. I didn't know if it was going to be a pre-ceremony, it was going to be a church ceremony, or what. And so December 9th, Stephen invited me to come to Little Rock. So I flew to Little Rock to meet the choir. And while I was there, the newspaper published that it was going to be done at the actual ceremony. And I almost flipped out because I'd never been to an inauguration of a president. And I thought all these people are going to be listening to it in the audience, not realizing that it was going to be listened to around the world. While I was in Stephen's office, the phone rang, and it was Colonel John Bourgeois from the United States Marine Band, who was trying to find me. I don't know how he found me, but he did. And he said they had played for every inauguration since Jefferson, and they wanted to accompany the piece I had written. So I said, okay. So he sent me the chart of the Marine Band, which of course is a 100-piece band, and all the instruments. So I spent Christmas rewriting the piece with all the band parts myself. And I remember him saying to me, "We have an arranger that can do it for you." And I said, "No, I'm a graduate of North Park College. I can do it."
Let
And I
them
had,
know, Dr. Curtis.
and I had a Mac Plus, and I've got this program, and I'm just working this thing. And sure enough, I completed it. I had sent Stephen, when I went to Little Rock, they sang it for me, just the choral part. In January, I was invited to go to the Marine Barracks with the orchestral score, or the band score, and they played it. And their arranger was sitting there with his pencil in his hand, and there were no mistakes. Because I went to North Park College. I know what I'm doing. And so there I was on January 20th, sitting next to the choir as they sang the piece for the President of the United States. And it was during the actual swearing in, as the piece was being done, that I realized that this was being broadcast around the world. And it was really, I thought, what are they going to think? Does it work? And we had some problems that most people don't know. What you heard at the inauguration was a shortened version, because the law is the president has to take the oath at noon. And Bill Clinton was notoriously late for everything. So we took out all the interludes so that it would be on time. As it turned out, he was early.
Oh.
So they had to put in filler music instead. So interesting. Afterwards, we went to the rotunda, and the president walked by and stopped and greeted Stephen, because he and Stephen were friends from Little Rock, and Hillary, and he stopped and he said to me, "It was so beautiful." That took it up. That was it. I was through. I was fine. And the piece is in the Clinton Library. It's in the Smithsonian African American Archives. It's in several libraries around the country. and it's still being done. I've done it several times, um, and it still gives me a thrill when I do it, because it was something that just doesn't happen to the average kid from Chicago who didn't go to Juilliard or didn't go to any great school. Any large school. I went to a small college, went to all small schools. But I remember Stephen said to me, he knew I could get it done and the way he wanted it. And so you talked a little earlier about being recognized as an African American composer. It did come up at the rehearsal for the Marine Barracks. They kept asking, "Where's the music?" They assumed it was going to be a gospel. It was an anthem. And finally, it was said to whoever was asking, "This is the music," because they assumed because I was black, it was going to be something you could pop your fingers to, and instead they got a full-fledged anthem piece of music. So there's this perception that all we write is gospel or spirituals, and that perception, I think, is being torn down. Mm-hmm. We now begin to explore other composers, and people begin to recognize that that Black people write all kinds of music, that we're not tied into one thing.
I want to interject a question here because it's right in line. I want to go back to your career in the academy. Dr. Albert Lee asked a question. He wants to know, Dr. Curtis, as an academician, how did you develop your fundraising acumen, and what were some of the mistakes you wish you avoided?
I developed those because I knew I had to find extra money. Mm-hmm. And I learned early on that there were grants available through arts councils, through different foundations. So when I lived in New York, I took a course called grant writing from the Apple Exchange. Mm-hmm. I learned about the foundation index, and I was always a curious kid, so I learned where all these resources were. And so that got me started. So my first forays into grant writing were very poor. Because I did not realize that you have to answer the question. You have to answer the grant question, and you also have to tell them not only how you're going to spend the money, but how you're going to make sure it's spent in the correct way. So it took me a while to figure out how to use language that could be read by a grant panel. And so that I had a very good woman at Fayetteville State University where I taught, Beverly, and I worked together. Beverly Warren was her name, and she sat with me, and she would ask me those questions, and when I would give her an esoteric answer, she would say, "Nope, try it again," till it was something that was concrete that could be measured. And so, when you were able to measure the results, you just can't say people will feel good. Mm-hmm. You show in some sort of way that will happen. Then it began to make sense to me. The other thing I did was I served for several years on one of the National Endowment for the Arts grant panels. A young guy that was in charge of the panels came through Fayetteville State, made a comment that he was looking for readers of color. So I volunteered, sent my resume. He called me up, and the next thing I knew, I was getting these boxes and serving on panels in Washington, D.C., sitting with other panelists and reading all these grants. And as you read them, you begin to see how people either answered the question or didn't answer the question, or how they did their research. And so I was able to score them and learn from that way also how to do all that. And so I began to realize that grants are not about you, it's about a project. And it has to be about a project and a collaborative project more than anything else. And how does that affect people? Particularly for me, it was my students and the community. And so that's how I got started in grant writing. I was able to help people and show them you have to answer those questions. And you just can't say, "I want money." Why do you want money? What do you do with it? How's it going to affect the community, people around you? And then how are you going to tell us what you did with it? And did it make a difference? And those are the questions that, as an academician, you have to be able to say and speak to. And sometimes the answers are I don't know yet, but you have to at least be honest about it. But grants are about having a plan, and you just can't sit down and say, "Oh, I want $1,000 to do X, Y, and Z." You have to have a plan, a project that makes sense, and that's realistic. And it may be the first in a series of grants to get you to what you want to do. So it's all about projects, collaboration, and knowing what you want to do, how you're going to do it, and how you're going to tell people that you did it.
You have certainly paid it forward, as I reminisce on you talking about Chicago and how Chicago nurtured you and your musicianship. I want to talk to you a little bit more about how you have nurtured the next generation of musicians through NAMM and being the chair of the scholarship um, uh, program and those opportunities. Talk about the importance of providing opportunities for our emerging artists.
Well, as we all know, lessons cost money. They're not cheap. The price we paid for piano lessons in the 60s is far less than they pay today. Also, the opportunities are out there for students, but you have to be seen and heard. And particularly for me as a Black educator, I wanted my students to have the same opportunities that non-Black students had.
Mm-hmm.
And so because I went to majority colleges, I was usually one of the few Black persons in there. I had some great experiences traveling around the world, traveling around the country, and I wanted my students that were Black to have the same experiences. So therefore, you have to start thinking, how can that happen? And one of the things I learned was that no is not an answer. That is not an answer. Let's see is the answer. Let's try to figure this out. And so when I was at Fayetteville State, I was able to take my choirs to Europe. And everybody thought I was crazy the first time. But I took 60 kids to London, I'm sorry, to Paris and to Belgium on tour. And I worked with a travel agent that happened to be the wife of my publisher. So that was a big help. But I had to convince parents and the kids we could do this because they had never been overseas. They didn't have passports. They didn't know, but many of them had been out of North Carolina, even on an airplane. So I had to convince them it was possible. And I had to show people it was possible. And the reason it was possible was because we could do it. But we also were taking music of Black composers with us as our program to Europe. So they actually billed us as the gospel choir, even though we weren't the gospel choir. Because in Europe, they assumed that's what we were going to do.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really, I think, as an educator, as a teacher, even before I got to the collegiate level, it was always about giving students opportunities and showing them things that my parents showed me. My mother took me to all the museums in Chicago religiously. I saw the Museum of Science and Industry from top to bottom, the Art Institute, the Field Museum. Our teachers took us places. I saw my first Broadway musical in 8th grade. It was Camelot, because our teacher took us to see a musical. I went to see Carmen in 7th grade and kept waiting for the woman to get stabbed, because that's all we knew about in 7th grade. And we all missed it completely, because it was in a foreign language, but it was still an experience. And so I wanted my students to have that same experience. And I realized that if I couldn't provide it, I had to find a way for it to be provided for. And I also found out as I started teaching more and more, that there were parents that wanted their students to have that experience, but didn't know how to do it. Mm-hmm. It was my job to make it happen. And so the arts became a way of exposing students a myriad of things that they could do. Of course, when I became a college professor, it was a little easier, but I also discovered that my students did not know what I knew from high school. And they didn't know anything about spirituals, didn't know about Black history, they didn't know anything about constellations, they didn't know anything that I had learned in Chicago. And so I began to try to impart that knowledge because I knew that they had to be able to navigate in this world. And I learned at a very early age that if you don't have the answer, you better go find it. My father and mother told us, if you don't have the answer, you go to A, you go to B, you go to C, you go to the whole alphabet, and you start with double A all over again. You find the answer. And so I've always been that kind of person where if, telling me no the first time doesn't usually work, I will come back and find, well, let's try this, or let's try that. Most times the no's have become, oh, he did that. How did he do that? I didn't take no for an answer. So for my students,
Wow.
it's always been about students first. How do I make my students have a better experience and have the experience that I had? I remember when I took the kids to Europe, you can imagine 60 black students on an airplane flying overnight from North Carolina, from Atlanta actually, because we went from Raleigh to Atlanta, Atlanta to Brussels. They got off this airplane in a foreign country. This is 1998.
Mm.
So the money was still the French franc and the Belgian franc, and they had no clue. I prepared them, and I gave them a manual and said, okay, the French franc is worth this much in American dollars. The Belgian franc is worth this much. You can't call home with a dime because it doesn't work like that. It's also 6 hours difference. So if you think it's 6 o'clock in Belgium, it's midnight at your parents' house. Be careful what you do because you're in a foreign country. You don't speak the language. It was an experience. And then to walk into these cathedrals, and one of our great experiences is that we sang a concert at Notre Dame.
Mm.
And my students walked in that church, Patrick, and they had, as one young lady said to me, I read about a flying buttress, I'd never seen one. And there she was looking at a flying buttress, standing up in the Eiffel Tower, looking at the rose-colored windows. And we sang Nathaniel Dent's Ave Maria
Oh,
in the
shout
cathedral.
out to Hampton.
Okay, exactly. I read that story about Nathaniel Dent in Europe. And so these kids got to see these cathedrals and these churches. And I was teasing them. I said, there's no Hammond organ up in here, okay? These are
Mm.
all pipe organs. These windows are older than all of us in this room. These cathedrals, and it was amazing. We went to the Louvre, and they didn't want to go at first, but I made them go. And at the end, they all came home with not just trinkets, but artwork, souvenirs that they had bought at that museum. We sang at Euro Disney, which was amazing because it's a huge place. It's 1/3 the size of Paris, and they rode every ride they could. But then we also did a concert, of secular stuff. So, it was a great experience. But that experience led us to another experience where an impresario heard us sing and invited us back the next year and paid for me to bring 30 students back for a 3-week tour of Belgium. So here are some of the students who went to Europe. The first time we had to pay, the second time they didn't have to pay.
Mm.
And sang in all these wonderful churches in Belgium, to all these packed houses, including the Church of the Royal Family. And it was just amazing, just amazing. But that's an experience that those students would never forget. They had passports for the first time in their life, and that's something that was important for me that our students have.
I want to go, if you don't mind, I want to go back to your compositional style because I have a great question in the chat that kind of ties perfectly in that, and it's from Kyle Wooten, who is a talented musician I've been following for years. So Kyle wants to know, Dr. Curtis, can you talk about Celebration Alleluia and Praising Song?
Okay.
What musical influence is behind the non-idiomatic choral what is the, let me read that a little bit better. What are the musical influence behind the non-idiomatic and choral accompaniment writing?
Let me start with Celebration Hallelujah first. I've always been a fan of the trumpet. And so the piece is designed for piano and trumpet. And so I think I wrote that one for Hampton University for the Ministers Conference. And so that was a piece that Roland, I think, asked me to compose as sort of like a clarion call. And if I remember correctly, Kyle, that was something else. But it was one of those pieces we did at the Hampton Conference, and it was designed to be an anthem, obviously an anthem. And if you look at the text of the majority of my compositions, they're biblically based. And so there was this text in the middle part of it. My style is usually a big opening chorus, a middle part that's sort of soft and introspective, and then the big chorus at the end. So that's that ABA style that I learned a long time ago. Praising Song was this commission I wrote, and it just sort of started as, because it's unaccompanied, it just started as a rhythmic exercise. Coming out of the Black church, coming out of that tradition, rhythms were very important to me. And we did a lot of William Dawson singing in high school, a lot of that. And also, when we did the Robbie Shaw arrangements, there was always this underlying pulse. There was also this pulse I learned in Bach when we did the motets, that was this underlying moving music forward. And so Praising Song became that sort of pulse movement song going forward. That's not a spiritual, it's just a regular anthem kind of piece with a lot of rhythm going forward. And it was hard to write because I'm a pianist. And you know, those rhythms correct as a pianist can be a little bit challenging sometimes. So, but that one has a little different, that one has no slowing down at all. That just goes lickety split. It just starts and just keeps on going. So that was the third piece I had published. And so I think people like it because it is a rhythmic piece of music. And it just sort of moves forward and forward and forward. So those two pieces, there's a contrast because Celebration Hallelujah, trumpet, accompaniment, and I hate writing accompaniments. At least I used to hate it because it was something knows as a pianist, but I figured it out. But it was the opening chorus, big, you know, the trumpet call. And to me, a trumpet is the thing that you want to open any piece of that trumpet clarion sound. And then there's this part in the middle that is sort of introspective, and then it comes back with, here it is, folks. And so that's how I sort of looked at those two things.
Wow. I want to actually interject another piece that we hadn't talked about yet, and that is an anthem, This Day. It's one of my favorites of yours. Could you maybe talk about the inspiration behind This Day?
This Day was written for the inauguration of Clark Atlanta University. Clark College and Atlanta University merged together, and Tom Hager was the choir director at the time, and he asked me he commissioned me to write a piece for the inaugural ceremony that brought both schools together, and the presidency of Thomas Cole, who was the first president. And so that piece became, I thought about the fact that there were two Black colleges coming together and what he was going to experience bringing two schools together. So that the middle part of that is a prayer. Teach me, O Lord, the way down to thy statutes. Because that, to me, it was a new day. It was this day. So it was a brand new day of a brand new school, Clark Atlanta University. So this was the day. And one of my favorite texts is from Psalms, this is the day which the Lord hath made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. So that was the opening. But the middle part was his prayer for Thomas Cole as president, to give him something to hold on to. But then somehow into my mind popped, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost. As it was in the beginning, shall be, world without end. Amen. That's the benediction. And then back to this day. So it's this big piece of music. It's about 20 pages long. And I was writing it, and I had to stop myself because it was going, it kept going and going and going and going. And I thought, this is too much. And of course, Tom had the brass and the timpani, and we did it for the inaugural ceremony of Clark Atlanta University. And what I was told was that they did it every year that Tom Cole was president.
Wow.
So it's a big piece, but it was that kind of piece that I wanted to say something to a president that was prayerful to give him some guidance. And once again, I call myself a text painter. So I take the words and try to paint a text with that, with the music. So you got a big opening, you got the introspective middle, but then there's other little piece. And I don't know if you noticed, I use this motif of the dotted quarter, quarter note, which is the African beat pattern. I was doing my doctorate at the time, and I've been studying African rhythms, and that was the basic beat pattern of the African rhythms. And so I used that as a basis for that part of the piece of music. And so just get this dum, 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 dum. And over the top of it is this rhythm thing going. And then back to This Is the Day again.
Wow. I would like to play a performance that I found. And this is a performance of This Day performed by the Hampton University Choir under the direction of Professor Omar Dickinson. And I'm going to play a little bit of that for the listeners.
Okay.
So that's a little bit of This Is the Day, so everybody could tell it. Oh, wow.
That's a program from the inauguration of Thomas Cole. It just happened to be here in the house. And it was performed the 24th of September, 1989. So this was
wow. It's such an ebullient piece, very festive. Thank you so much for allowing me to play that. And as we wrap up our time together, Dr. Curtis, I feel like we need a part two because you have so much of a breadth of a career: composer, conductor, administrator, professor of music. My goodness, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. We have a few questions that I definitely would like to get to. And of course, at the end, I want to play this special tribute from Indiana, South Bend. And there's an excerpt, of course, from A City on the Hill. But I want to ask you a question that was entertained from my dear friend Dwayne Curtis from the Bahamas. And this is more of a COVID-19 question. He is asking you, what do you suggest for us musicians who, in this COVID age, have no opportunity for fellowship through making music together? He goes on further to say, it is okay listening to great recordings and videos, but there's nothing like getting together with other people, either as a participant or live audience. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think Zoom has become a great thing for me in terms of connecting with people. In this time, you have to connect through some means. And Zoom allows you to, or this vehicle as well, allows you to see people and talk to people, and even and even do some things together. Um, and I think that is important that we stay connected through social media any way that you can. Obviously, my church has not met since March, but we do a Zoom service every Sunday, and then we have a Zoom coffee hour where people can just tune in at 11 o'clock and talk to each other for an hour. And I think you have to do that. You have to find a way to make it happen, even if it's the concerts that people have been doing in their homes. You have to keep doing that. You have to stay connected. And it's hard, but we are artists. We are creative. We have to find those solutions to be creative. And so for me, it is calling up my friends, doing FaceTime with them, talking about music, talking about different things. It's just something that we have to do now. We just can't be isolated.
You're so right. And even, myself as a church musician, we started doing Facebook Live from Easter Sunday on. And, it's a lot of preparation. I would say even for the virtual experience that you have to put in more so than when you go live. So I definitely empathize. I wanted to bring up something that I found out in my research preparing for the interview. Now, we talked about you being a church musician. We talked about you being an educator, and of course, a composer of sacred music and the like. But could you talk a little bit about your foray into your first film score project?
Yes. I was approached by a man named Mike Wargo here in South Bend, who was going to Uganda every year on a mission to help people who were dealing with with young people whose parents had died from either AIDS or tuberculosis, whatever. It was a palliative care. And he had done one movie already, and he came back and did a second movie, and it's about a young man named George. It turned out to be about 4 or 5 different young people from Uganda. And so I was at the parking lot of the cleaners, and he said, "I want to talk to you." When I get back, I said, "Okay, call me." And he asked me about writing a score for a film. I had never done one. But of course, you never say no. So through working with another faculty member at the school, we were able to produce a score for this documentary called "Road to Hope," which has won numerous awards around the world. And it was my first time doing something like that. And now I'm about to do it again for another project here in South Bend. WNIT, which is our public television station, is going to be doing a film on the St. Joseph River. And I've been selected to write the music for that documentary as well. So I'll be working with the filmmakers and coming up with the ideas on how to write music, talk about this river that will be aired next August. So as they do footage, I have to do ideas and figure out the themes and stuff like that. But it's all about being creative. So I watched the film, come up with something that I think it works. Where do you want music? How do you want it done? Where we're going to put it? And it was a technique that I never studied, but I'm a composer, so you figure it out. And like I said, you never say no. You say, okay, let's work on it. And so we were able to get it together, and I'm really proud of that part of my life now. Now I'm about to do a second one.
Wow. Dr. Curtis, I just appreciate you so much because you have been so gracious, I think I kind of had a fanboy moment when I first got a chance to interact with you, because I read about, Dr. Curtis, Marvin V. Curtis. I said, now I actually know him in the flesh. And I like the fact that you said, well, Patrick, you can call me Marvin, but I just feel so much respect for you. I feel like I have to give you that mantle. And I just want to let you know before this audience that I truly honor you. And I just thank you for all of your contributions, to this art form and how you have reached back to mentor young artists. As we close, I want to speak more in that vein to anyone who is a composer. What words of advice would you give to someone who's aspiring to really get their music out there before the public?
perseverance. Never let no be the final answer. I got a lot of letters of rejection. I got people who actually said to me after the president's speech, well, he was all right. And I said to myself, Bill Clinton said he liked it. That's all that counts. You have to have within you the desire, and I think you have to keep trying. I admire people like Marcus Garrett, Brandon Boyd, Brandon Wallace. These are guys that I've known and watched them now mature into musicians, and I keep pushing them a little bit. Say, as Roland Carter pushed me. Roland Carter is one of my great mentors, and Roland gave me opportunities that were incredible for me to write for the Hampton Ministers Conference. That's a huge thing to be able to write for that and to be called a composer. And it's opening those doors. So keep knocking on those doors, keep putting it out there, get people to sing your music, play it yourself, if you have to, till people hear it. And it's always that one, when you're about to give up, is when it actually happens to you. And have faith. My faith has kept me going through the good times and the bad times. And it's about that. But your music must have a message. Let me just put that out there, Patrick. Certain things all begin to sound the same. What makes your music different? What makes your music different? What makes people sit up and go, oh, I like that? What moves people about your music? As a conductor, I always tell my choirs, if a person says to me, that was a great performance, that's one thing. If they say to me, I was moved, I've done my job.
That's certainly important, to be moved. Thank you again, Dr. Curtis.
Thank you.
Yeah, as we close, I want to play this special montage that was prepared for you, celebrating your time in Indiana and just the breadth of your career. So I'm going to bring that up. And you all, thank you so much for joining us for the Maestro series. And just while I have this moment, I do want to announce the next installment of the Maestro series, which will be Dr. Eugene Rogers, who is the newly minted conductor of the Washington Chorus. So you will see more information posted on that, but I do want to put that bug out there. But Dr. Curtis, of course, this has been such a joy to have you on. And I do want to take a moment to play this montage, which includes an excerpt of A City on a Hill.
Thank you, Patrick.
You're welcome. So let's see.
I haven't done anything yet.
Beautiful and
Thank
so well deserved. Thank you so much again, Dr. Kurtz, for joining us for this installment of the Maestro series.
Patrick, I thank you for inviting me.
And always wishing you the best. And again, audience, this has been Patrick D. McCoy, and this has been Across the Arts, and this has been our installment of the Maestro series. Thank you all so much for joining us, and it's just been a true pleasure and honor to speak with Dr. Marvin V. Curtis today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.